The United States suspends it all, period. Not to be reconsidered, reevaluated later, period. It's over. We stop all aid to Ukraine, number one. Number two, we get all of our people out of Ukraine, all of our forces, whatever is in there that is American, leaves. And if we do that, the rest of the NATO allies will follow suit very quickly. That's clear and unambiguous to the Russians that we're serious. At that point, I think the Russians would consider any number of things, but that's critical to meeting their conditions. If we insist on an immediate ceasefire and say the Ukrainians are willing to ceasefire, of course, Ukrainians' backs are up against the wall. The regime in Kiev is on its last legs. There's no question about that. But as long as they are receiving aid from us, as long as we are still on the ground in Ukraine, providing the intelligence, the technical expertise, whatever is required to sustain these long-range strikes against Russia, the Ukrainians are going to continue. There is no evidence for any good faith on the Ukrainian side whatsoever. And I think that's what Lavrov and Putin are saying. The concern in Russia is that at every turn, this regime in Kiev will look for every opportunity to resume fighting. And therefore, what is the point of a ceasefire if it's simply going to be treated as rest, refit, reorganize so that you can come back again and threaten Russia? It's that simple. And I don't know how you get around that. If I were a Russian, I would take the same position. So again, we're the ones that created this war. Without us, there would have been no Ukraine war. We are the ones that staged this coup and installed a government that otherwise would not have come to power. We are the ones that subsidized the building and structuring of a Ukrainian force that had one purpose and only one purpose: to attack Russia, to retake Crimea, but to march into Russia. This was a machine that was fueled with more than money and cash and technology. It was fueled with hatred on a scale that we haven't seen for decades. That's all unacceptable. So we really need to stop it. How do you stop it? Stop the aid to Ukraine, pull us all out, and then talk to the Russians. Right now, we have not demonstrated that we're willing to do anything. We're instead acting as though we're the victors strategically in this conflict. We're not. Neither is Ukraine. And we're trying to dictate the outcome to Moscow. It's not going to work. If we signal that's over, we make it very clear that we've had it with that. We will not subsidize that anymore. And that's something that President Trump can do easily because he was never part of it. The longer he waits, with each passing day that we dither and refuse to take decisive action, cut the aid, pull everybody out, the more and more this looks like President Trump's war. And that's not a good thing. It's a drain on our resources, time and effort, and it still has the potential to expand. That's what's most disturbing. The Russians have laid out the conditions. They have been made very clear. Those conditions are easily picked up and read anywhere by us or anyone else. Zelensky is going to continue doing whatever he does with his band of thugs in Kiev to attack Russians with whatever he's given. That's his goal. He's going to go down with a ship. We shouldn't be subsidizing that. The president is right. We don't want more Russians or Ukrainians to be. By the way, neither does President Putin. So the first step that we need to take is cut off all aid to Ukraine, period. We already know that most of it, if not at least half of it, has ended up in a black hole of corruption and criminality in Ukraine. Stop sending it. Then get all of us Americans in and out of uniform, members of the intelligence organizations, the people serving over there, get them out. Everybody leaves. When those things happen, the Ukrainians will sue for peace, and the Russians will sit down and they'll begin to hammer out an agreement. So the notion that the ceasefire is a precondition for an agreement is dead in the water. So all he said is, I guess we're dead in the water, which is a very unprofessional response at this stage. But again, there doesn't seem to be an appreciation for the fact that you keep talking about ceasefire, and for months and months, the Russians have said, no, thank you. There will be no ceasefire. We will negotiate, but we're going to fight while we negotiate. We're not going to accept anything until the fighting is over. And the ceasefire is not the first item on the agenda. That's the last item. So I don't know how you resolve it other than to say, then let's go back to the drawing board and look again at the conditions that Moscow outlined. I think that's what they should go back and do. So the notion that if we don't get X, then we have to support this is ridiculous. We don't have to support this at all. We shouldn't support it. We should never have supported it. And that was Trump's brilliant opportunity to step forward and say, I have no interest in subverting Russia. I have no interest in destroying Russia. I have no interest in using Ukrainian lives, even though they've got none, to destroy Russia. That's not my goal. My goal is peace. So the first step in that direction is cut the aid and pull us out. Get us out of there completely. And the other Europeans will then subsequently follow. That's tangible. That's real. You do that, and the Russians are going to say, I guess they're serious. They really want to stop this war. And then you sit down and you negotiate. And I think it could be done. Russia has already claimed victory in eastern Ukraine. It's theirs. They hold the initiative. They can move strategically in any number of different directions. We talked before about the concentrations of force in eastern Ukraine, down in Kherson, all the way to Zaporizhia, and up north in and around Kharkov. They can move as they wish at Putin's command. And there's nothing that we can do about it unless we want to declare war on Russia. I don't think we do. I don't think anybody is interested in that. But the way we're approaching this, it's becoming it's got to be a win for me. If I can't get a win out of this, if I don't look like I'm winning, then I can't do it. This is a situation in which we're not winners, and we're not going to be winners, and the Ukrainians are certainly losers. There's no question about that. So the point is, there's a way to do this, but we're not approaching it reasonably. We're trying to take the position that we're the United States, we're the great hegemon, and you've got to do these things or we won't play. The Russians are going to say, fine, then we're not playing. And they will continue to move in whatever direction they want to secure whatever it is on the ground that they want. The good news is that President Putin and his government want to talk to us. The good news is that the Russian government and its businesses across Russia want to do business with us. That's all good news. We should keep that in the forefront. The bad news is the ceasefire insistence it's forget it. There will be no ceasefire. Look at the conditions. How do we meet these conditions? And the key to meeting those conditions is what I've said before: end the aid and withdraw people. If that doesn't happen, I don't think much will change, except that the map will probably be altered and the borders will be further advanced to the west. So I think we need to send that signal back to Moscow. And remember something else, and this never seems to come up for discussion, which is so depressing. Russia is a Pacific power. Russia is a Central Asian power. Russia, for all intents and purposes, because of its reach into the Caucasus, is practically a Middle Eastern power. In other words, Russia is more than just a European power. Under those circumstances, Russia can be enormously helpful to us in terms of our strategic interests, what we want to achieve. And we seem to ignore that. In other words, it's enormous benefit to the United States, the American people, to cooperate with Russia. That's what we should be thinking about right now. That's where we need to focus. President Trump is too good of a businessman to do otherwise. He needs to stop and recollect that very carefully, because it's terribly important. As soon as you halt military aid and assistance to the Ukrainian state and you withdraw all of our advisors, military advisors, intelligence advisors, technicians, get them all out, I think the entire Ukrainian house of cards will collapse. There's nothing left. So I think that's the key to ending the war. And I don't understand why we won't do that, because this argument that there's something legitimate about Zelensky and his regime is fundamentally false. His regime is more oppressive and more objectionable and obnoxious morally than I think almost any other that I've seen in many decades. We shouldn't be supporting it under any circumstances. So I don't have a problem with the conditions that the Russians have stipulated, and I'm quite confident that they'll abide by those. But again, you want an agreement that we can sign along with the people that border Ukraine. In other words, the Poles, the Slovaks, Moldova, Romania, Lithuania. They should all sit down, and we should, and by the way, the Germans, who have a long-term strategic interest in the region, they too should be co-signatories. And if they do that, and we do that, and the Russians do it, it'll work. I'm quite confident of it. The Austrians ended up with a very small army, which was really largely paramilitary, and they were granted neutrality. They were granted the opportunity to govern themselves as they saw fit. And the Russians agreed, or the Soviets agreed at the time, that there would be no interference in the internal affairs of Austria, and they could develop independently. It worked. I see no reason why that would not also work in Ukraine. So I don't think that's unreasonable by any stretch of the imagination, especially when the Ukrainians have lost over 1 million and the Russians have lost roughly 100,000. I think everybody has an interest in putting this to bed once and for all. And the Russians aren't going to live with a 500 or 600,000 man army armed to the teeth, focused exclusively on Russia when the war ends. So that's nonsense. So no, I think it is doable, but it's not going to happen with Zelensky and his crowd. The underlying argument against this is always the same fiction. The Russians want to conquer Europe. No, they don't. Who in their right mind wants to do it? Why? To drink a latte in Paris? You know, look at the mess that Europe is in right now. Who in their right mind would want to have to manage? It's the last thing in the world the Russians are interested in. Those who are globalists, who oppose peace under any circumstances with Russia, who are determined to destroy Russia and want to sabotage our effort at normalization, have come out and said, no, he's a hero, and we're going to support him to the bitter end, and we're going to send him all this aid and equipment. This is a joke, and that will become increasingly clear. From the Russian standpoint, they're not paying much attention to the Europeans. They know the facts. They're much more interested in normalization with us because they know ultimately the Europeans will come along with us. And it's inevitable that they will, because they too, their populations share our interest in peace, prosperity, and stability in Europe. The only way to get there is to follow President Trump's lead. The first thing that must happen is that President Trump, and I would hope now in light of this destructive meeting, he immediately ends any further military aid and assistance to Ukraine. No more. Stop immediately. And then secondly, I would tell everyone who is an American citizen in Ukraine, whether they are military, intelligence, or simply diplomatic, doesn't make any difference. Contractors, get out. Leave the country immediately, because this man, Zelensky, presides over a thugocracy run by this vicious secret police and these and I would not at all put it past them to start harming American citizens who have been helping them. So I would get them out immediately as well. In the meantime, President Trump has taken steps to remove forces from Germany, to begin closing bases there. He's quite serious about this. He was serious 4 years ago when I met him in the Oval Office in 2020. He made it very clear that was his goal. He's correct. He wants to move in the right direction. He wants Europe to be its own first responder, and that can be done. But he has now broken with the globalists, because the globalists have been perpetrating this false narrative that depicts Russia as evil incarnate. They are not. They are not Cold War Russia. They are not Soviet communists. They are Russians. And they want an end to this war as badly as anybody else. They have no desire to march further west. That doesn't mean they will not if their security is at risk. They simply want their legitimate security interests recognized. And that's what President Trump has set out to do, just as they recognize our legitimate security interests and those of the Europeans. They want an Austrian-style neutrality for Ukraine. That has worked brilliantly in Central Europe. It can work brilliantly in Ukraine. And I think President Trump knows that. It's a matter of time now for the Europeans to sober up and come to terms with reality. But their populations are way ahead of the governments. Even Tusk in Poland, who is hardly an opponent of globalism, he is a globalist, has said under no circumstances would Polish troops contribute to any peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Hallelujah. Thank God. It's time to get this out in the open, but an end to this nonsense. The Fugazi is in London. The Fugazi is in Paris. And I see no evidence that the Germans want anything to do with that nonsense. I think the Russians will exercise patience. And if the British and the French try to take the whole British army, which is roughly 75,000, and the whole French army, which is 120,000, and move it all to Western Ukraine, I don't think the French population or the British population will tolerate it. Remember, the Poles, so this is Donald Tusk, who's not exactly a opponent of globalism in Poland, has already said the Poles will contribute nothing, no troops to anything in Western Ukraine. So if you can't get the Poles that have served effectively as a logistical forward operating base for NATO to join this, who are the British and the French kidding? They're kidding themselves, and they're making fools out of themselves. And if you look at Paris, that place is at a boil. It's only a question of when it boils over, and Macron and a lot of other people may be gone. The Russians aren't fools. They know that. The Starmer government in London, which is probably the leading contender for the stupidity award right now regarding Russia, has one foot in the grave. All right. I don't know how much longer Starmer's going to be there. In one way or another, they're always trying to sound like or behave like Churchill. And unfortunately, they forgot to point out that Churchill bankrupted Great Britain, reduced it to a second-rate power, and lost the British Empire. They better wake up. The future is not the past. And they've got to chart a new course, and they've got to listen to their own people. Exactly what Vice President Vance said. They're not listening to the people in England, Scotland, Ireland, or Wales, and the French leadership are not listening to the Frenchmen on the ground in France. It has to stop. We have to end this nonsense with NATO, and I think they will, because they know that they need Russian energy, and the Russians are quite anxious to do business with the Germans, which is an old relationship. We don't need to see that as a danger to us, because it isn't. And I think the Germans have begun to figure it out. It'll take a little longer, but eventually they'll get there. But this man Merz is beginning to change his tune, thank goodness. But it may not be enough. He may only be there for 6 months or 8 months, and then you'll finally get a government that just tells the truth. These things take time. I think the Russians will exercise patience. Starmer is even more irrelevant and more deluded than Liz Truss ever was. Just imagine in Great Britain right now, where you have a lot of people that are living just above the poverty line that could crash right through and end up in poverty, especially if their treasury market, they call them gilts, collapses. It almost collapsed under Liz Truss. That's one of the reasons she was ushered out of the room. And she was talking about Thatcherism, which makes no sense and is totally irrelevant to Great Britain today. The other thing is, I was coming in here, I was handed a note by the boss, and he said, we've calculated that to fund the war in Ukraine, every family in America, every tax-paying citizen in America has to fork over $2,400 every year to the federal government. That's just Ukrainian aid. We haven't talked about the Middle East. We haven't talked about the wasteful spending on the Taiwan business. We haven't talked about any of that. Just think about that. If every taxpayer had to pay $2,400 every year to fund our support for Ukraine or the proxy war in Ukraine, how long would it last? And I'm sure the Russians understand that. We just need to move on down the road. President Trump needs to move forward, and the rest eventually will get on board of that. So this is the problem with central banking. Central banking and war, waging war go hand in hand. As long as you have a central bank that can create money from nothing, you're going to continue to see these wars. And that certainly is true in Great Britain, and I would argue everywhere. The second part is free speech. What's free speech? Free speech too often turns out to be something that the people in power can tolerate, not necessarily what everybody thinks. And the right of free expression simply doesn't exist right now. It's curtailed here. I hope it improves. But there's a lot of censorship. There are protected classes, things you can't say. This is all nonsense. It needs to go away. And I think President Trump has made it clear he wants to head in that direction. But the Europeans, at least the globalist leaders that we're dealing with right now, they're not on board with that. They've got to go away too. This war is over. He knows it. And the promises that the British and the French are making, as Dan pointed out, are meaningless nonsense. So the real issue today is, when will someone stand up and say, thank you, Mr. Zelensky, for your interest in Ukraine's national defense. Goodbye. I think that's coming. I think we're seeing peace gradually returned to Europe. And I think we've seen the beginning of the end of this insane and stupid and unnecessary war in Ukraine. This man, Zelensky, does not represent the interests of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people want an end to this conflict. I don't care what they say the polls are telling them. I don't believe the pollsters. I think the Ukrainian people have absolutely had enough of it. So the question at this stage is, we want peace, then how do we get to a settlement? And that's really what President Trump was trying to say to him. But the idea that we should have any economic agreement in place ahead of time is just irrational. And Besament is spot on. First, you've got to have peace. You've got to have an end to the fighting. Then you can talk about economic recovery and economic cooperation. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are we not stopping the delivery of military aid and assistance to Zelensky? That's what's keeping him alive. That's his lifeline. That's the cash that he stuffs into his bank accounts and the bank accounts of his cronies that are helping to rule and ultimately destroy Ukraine. That's what keeps the generals happy and the colonels in the army, and why they continue to send their men out to die pointlessly. They're all handsomely paid. Why not stop that right now? That's the first thing. And then turn around and say, everybody who's an American citizen, get out, leave. Then President Trump can decide who he wants to send back in at some point. But right now, everybody who is there is a legacy of the past, a legacy of the last administration, a legacy of the wrong policy. Get them out. I think the Russians have made it abundantly clear what they want. They've talked about the so-called breakaway provinces, the territories that they hold. There will be no discussion about the legitimate control of those or Crimea. They've also said that they're not going to agree to a ceasefire until they're sure that the denazification of Ukraine is going to go to completion, until Ukrainian arms are completely defeated. We know these things. So I don't think we have to have a meeting with them to figure it out, unless you absolutely end the military aid to the Ukrainian state at this stage, whatever it is. It's not taken seriously. The Russians have heard lots of talk. We've lied to them prolifically for years about everything. The Russians are about action. When you listen to Lavrov, Putin, the others, they want to see evidence for action. The action is all aid stops immediately, number one. Number two, Americans, we are leaving. We're out. For our purposes, we have nothing more to do with this Ukrainian state, which is the epitome of corruption and incompetence. I think President Trump has a realistic grasp now. He knows that the Russians have won. He knows the power that they have over the situation, and he wants an end to this, and he wants good relations with Russia. Hallelujah. Thank God. It's about time. But I don't think anyone has helped him with a roadmap to get there. And I don't know what you can do at this point other than hope that these things will happen and we can get going. President Trump has always had good instincts. I've said this forever. Yeah. Follow his instincts, he'll be successful. The problem is he's always got a lot of people around him derailing him. And that's what happened during the last administration. This has been a much more successful beginning this time around, and that's great. But he's got to follow it up with decisive action. The British Treasury market, they call them gilts, is in serious trouble. The British Precious Metals Exchange, which involves the gold exchange in London, is in trouble. The country is in trouble. And he is not in a position to ship billions of pounds into the black hole of corruption and incompetence in Ukraine. He knows it. He needs to stop talking about it. And I think behind closed doors, Starmer was asking for assistance in that regard that we can probably give to a limited extent, but we can't bail them out any more than we can bail ourselves out, because we too are facing a similar dilemma in the financial system in the United States. I think we've had a series of prime ministers. They all want to sound like Churchill, and they want to be heroic figures and posture for the public. But they forget that Winston Churchill bankrupted Britain, destroyed national power of Britain, and ultimately destroyed the British Empire. So they better sober up, because they're about to destroy what's left of Britain if they don't stop. I give Starmer 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the most. He's not going to survive this. He's in the same position Liz Truss was when she took over and then started talking about Thatcherism, and the gilt market erupted, and she was quickly ushered off stage. They barely held the financial system together. This time around, it's going to be very difficult to do. We are the ones that are in control of Ukraine. We can step in. We can stop the Ukrainians in their tracks right now, ceasefire, back off, and put an end to the war. We're not doing that. We're actually making it easier for whatever is left over there, and there's not much, to continue the war. And more important, we're adding insult to injury. We're saying you can't do anything on the battlefield, but you have these devices that allow you to fire hundreds of kilometers into Russia. Go ahead and do it. It doesn't make any sense, Dan. I think we're missing that, the whole point of neutrality. And then secondly, what are we doing? We seem to be intent on sustaining this war. We are continuing military aid and assistance. Now we're going to provide sensitive intelligence. For what purpose? So that the Ukrainians can launch more long-range strike drones or missiles that will Russians inside Russia? Is that our goal? Because if that's the goal, that is not going to produce peace. It's not going to produce an agreement of any kind. Whatever emerges on the map in the future that we call Ukraine will be neutral on the Austrian state treaty model. And there was no thought about deterring the Russians from invading Austria. Once that treaty was signed, the Soviets left, and they didn't come back, and they had no intention of ever returning. And by the way, they were only just over the border inside Hungary. So they could have easily come back at any point in time that they wanted to do so. The question is, can the Russians trust us? Because we have a bad habit of backpedaling, misinterpreting. They go back to the Budapest Memorandum. They go back to the Minsk Accords. And so they ask themselves, can we trust the West? I think that's the more important question. I think, yes, President Trump can be trusted, but we've got to demonstrate that we are fundamentally different from the last bunch that was in power. In other words, since 1945, after the Second World War, the Finns and the Russians have done a land office business economically and have gotten along without any threats to Finland and its territorial integrity. I think we can trust the Russians in that sense. Look at Finland went through a terrible war. They fought bravely, and large numbers of Russians, about 250,000, against 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 Finns. And the Russians did not want to fight their way to Helsinki. They wanted an end to the conflict. They ended up taking territory from Finland, but then they established a treaty, and that treaty guaranteed Finnish existence, independence, and neutrality. There has never been an incident since then. We should be celebrating the fact that the Russians want to stop this at all and be very glad that they want to have a neutral Ukraine. Remember, we talked years ago, Dan, that Ukraine's principal mission in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet state system was to be this large neutral state that separated us from Russia. That was in the interest of Russia. We thought it was in the interest of NATO. Suddenly that was overturned and we launched into this madness. We need to get back to thinking in those terms. And we need to talk about what a future treaty would entail. And that's why we go back to the Austrian state treaty. And by the way, the security guarantees in the Austrian state treaty had nothing to do with deterrence. They had everything to do with guaranteeing freedom, rights, position, all of these things within Austria that was acceptable to both sides. And that's what we should be interested in. The Russians are already sitting at the table. They've made very clear what their conditions are to negotiate an end to this disaster. So let's drop that nonsense. We know that. We need to take action that supports the conditions that they've